seconds to introduce during the session. We have tonight the book launch of American Fever. We're exceptionally grateful to both our panelists, especially Durre Aziz Amna, who's flown in from New Jersey specifically for this conference for 2 nights, and she'll be going out tonight. Durre Aziz Amna just recently published her debut novel, American Fever, which has received a great appreciation from all quarters. Mariam Tareen recently reviewed Durre's book for Dawn, and she's the founder of the writing group and is also a member of the board of advisors for the Indus Conclave. Thank you so much, Mariam and Durre, for all that you've done for us, and over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Raja. Durre, it's an honor to be here with you at your Pakistan book launch. As Raza has already introduced Durre, the author of American Fever, I don't know how many of you here read it. I just want to mention that it's available in readings now in Hall 1. So if you want to, definitely go. Durre will be signing books at the end of this session there as well. It's such a funny and sharp and poignant coming-of-age story of a 16-year-old girl set between Rawalpindi, Multan, and rural Oregon. And Durre's work is also appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, Al Jazeera, among other places. She was selected as Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2022, and she won the 2019 Financial Times Bodley Head Essay Prize as well. Thank you, Durre, for being with us here today.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you, Raza, for that generous introduction. Right? And also thank you, Mariam. I feel like Mariam is such a wonderful part of the Lahori English writing scene, and you've been so important, and you're so good at supporting new writers. So it's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Durre, first of all, congratulations. The book is brilliant. I loved it, and you've already gotten glowing reviews in The Guardian and other places. I hope that in the midst of all the noise, you've taken some time to enjoy your success.
Yeah, I mean, being here especially is definitely, it's wonderful because obviously I wrote this book. I lived abroad now for about 11 years, but I wrote this book, and fortunately or unfortunately with a very specific audience in mind, which is the people in this hall. And so, like, in terms of how, with celebrations, this definitely feels like up there. Yeah.
Feels like coming home in a way, I'm sure. So tell me, Durre, did you always want to become a writer? How did you come to writing, and when did you first think of writing this novel?
I think I have written in some capacity or the other for as long as I remember. And I think that, like a lot of writers, I started off just sort of like that lonely reader in a room, not wanting to make friends. And so, and then at some point I started, my initial training was writing for those, like, the supplements that come with the English newspapers in Pakistan, there's Essay, the young adult sections. And then since then, I've written in some capacity or the other, but it was only about 3 or 4 years ago when I sort of gave myself the freedom to start another project, which became this one.
And the book is partly autobiographical in the sense that you did a year abroad exchange program in the same place where Hira does.
Correct. Yes.
So, at what point during that program did you decide to write a fictionalized account?
जो मैंने प्रोग्राम अटेंड किया था, वो था 2008 में, और I only started writing this book in 2018. So it was 10 years had passed.
10 years gap.
And I just, and it was just, I felt like it was sufficiently in the past that it could be taken internally fiction without, because I think that a lot of times when you're writing about something that's partly autobiographical, there's a strange thing that happens, which is that you almost tell yourself, maybe ये तो नहीं देख सकती, ऐसे तो नहीं हुआ था, and then like you have to remind yourself, actually it doesn't matter कि कैसे हुआ था, आप एक novel लिख रहे हो, creating a work. And so I thought that enough time had elapsed that I could, start giving myself that freedom.
And did you ever think in 2008 when you were doing the program that you would write a novel on it and you'd be sitting here discussing it?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. At what point did you think maybe I should write about that experience?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think that for me, I'm born and raised in Rawalpindi, or मेरे लिए that was the very first time that besides going for Nora, that was the first time I was leaving the country. Or फिर मैं गई भी, I literally went from one of the biggest cities in Pakistan to this highway town in rural Oregon, which is even एक रियासत है. Or it was just everything about that experience was so strange and surreal and foreign. The reason why I thought it was a great sort of experience to turn into a first novel was because it was a very concrete, like a discrete experience. Okay, एक साल का था मैं गई मैं वापस आ गई, so it felt like a very, especially for a first novel, like very, I don't know how to put it, like sort of maybe a neat and contained thing to turn into fiction. Yeah.
And that's interesting how you say that you went from one of the biggest cities in Pakistan to a tiny town in rural America, which is really interesting because your novel does that a lot. There are a lot of reversals of these stereotypes that we normally see in English fiction. So, for example, your novel is not what they call an immigrant novel, because your character Hira goes there and she's there for a year and she's going to come back. So there's no pressure on her to like, this is my home now. So it's more observational and it's slightly anthropological also, that she's there and she's observing Americans and how they live in this rural town. Did you do that on purpose, these reversals?
Yeah, no, I initially not, and then I think at some point I realized that I was subconsciously doing it, and so I think I leaned into it more, because obviously there is this entire genre of the Westerner in the Eastern and like Graham Greene, who wrote about Americans in Vietnam. There's so many novels of that genre, or so much writing, and I wanted to sort of, like, as you said, reverse that case. And also because she also is not an immigrant, right? She's going there for a very discrete program. She knows that there's a return date. And so what does that puts her firmly in that observational camp. She doesn't have the stakes that an immigrant does.
Yeah, and again, some of your very interesting scenes and dialogue is also related to that, because everyone in America expects that now that you're there, now that Hira is there, she would want to stay there, because who wouldn't land an opportunity? And so Hira also sort of, Janki also pushes back against that narrative as well. So how much of that was your experience when you were in America? And how much of that is Hira's own character, where she's sort of pushing back against these stereotypes and getting very frustrated by them?
Yeah. So ये जो मैंने program किया था, it has a very the one that Hira does in the book, which is basically it's like a 10-month long exchange program that takes Pakistani students from middle class. Most of them are taken from government schools, and so they're sent to the US. And actually, it has a very interesting history. It was started right after 9/11 as a way of sort of the official line is that to like foster understanding, but the understanding is obviously very one-sided because कोई अमेरिकी यहाँ नहीं आ रहा था. So yeah, and I'm okay. I'm like completely lost what we were in the discussion.
That's fine. So just related to this is my next question, which is you use a lot of Desi words, and not just Desi words in your novel, but a lot of Desi sentence structure, a lot of stuff that would go over the head of someone who wasn't familiar with Urdu. And your essay has also been about language. Can you speak about the role of language in your life and how you navigated a balance between Urdu and English as you were writing the novel? Because a lot of the novel takes place back home, Rawalpindi in Multan, where Hira's grandparents are. And then she has to, and my favorite sentence of the whole novel, when she lands there, she says, "Why have I been placed in the Chicha Batni of America?" Which is so interesting to me because only someone from Pakistan would understand what that was. So clearly you are writing towards us as an audience, primarily. But what was your sort of, what kind of things did you navigate when you were writing in between the two languages?
Yeah, so when I wrote the novel, I did not think it was about language. when the novel came out, so many people, especially Pakistanis, told me that the novel was about language, and it completely makes sense. It completely makes sense to me because, as you said, I've written an essay about it. It's something that occupies me a lot, and there's no way it can't for so many of us who we are constantly living between so many languages. Obviously, we're here on the stage, given the sort of a lot of these sort of like official talks are held in the language that we are talking in, but as soon as you leave this room, that thing changes. As soon as I start talking to my father, something changes. As soon as my father starts talking to my mother, it changes again because it becomes Punjabi and not Urdu. And so this is something that we are constantly living in, and so it completely makes sense to me that a character like Hira, who's so fresh from a multilingual land, would just suddenly notice so viscerally that, okay, suddenly I'm in a very, very monolingual surrounding, right? And especially because for her, English is again like the medium in which you have intellectual discussions and the medium in which you are taught at school, but it is not the language of your everyday. It's not like the fabric in which you live your days. And so for her to suddenly go to that, it's a very jarring experience for her.
And I just want to say that Hira, the main character, this teenage Pakistani girl, her judgment is not only reserved for America and for the Americans she meets. It's pretty egalitarian, and no one is really spared from her very sharp judgment and her sharp wit. Not her friends and family back home, and not even the Pakistani diaspora who she meets in New Jersey. And in one of your interviews that I was just looking at this morning, you say you realize that the only way to get out of this burden of representation is to understand you don't owe it to either culture. So can you speak a bit about what you meant?
Yeah, I think if there were people in the room yesterday when we had the wonderful conversation with Bilal Hamid and Meera Sethi, we talked about this a little bit yesterday as well, that I want to say that, of course, when you move from one country to another, especially, now that I've attended enough of these talks in Pakistan as well, that I know that this is something that even people, so it's not like clear kind of when you go abroad, you have to constantly think about representation. I actually think that people in Pakistan constantly think about this question as well, because obviously it's a young country. It was created in a very, very specific post-colonial circumstance, and so I think that so many people are constantly thinking about that, the gaze of the other. Like whenever I have a chat like this, the first thing my nanny calls and tells me is like, "Oh, beta Pakistan ke liye kitna acha." It's like, नहीं आप बैठ के बात कर रहे हैं उससे पाकिस्तान में क्या भला होता है. लेकिन I don't think that. I think what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that people sometimes think about your position in the world only when we leave, but I do think that it is something that's pervasive even within our psyche at home. That said, of course, like for Hira, that question is sort of like the dial is turned up way up, and so when she goes there, she suddenly has to start answering on the behalf of an entire country, an entire nation, one that she frankly hasn't seen much of herself. And she comes from like a somewhat privileged position in Pakistan. She's born and raised in a big city. She has only really seen some parts of Punjab. And so for her to suddenly be put in that position, and I think that her way of dealing with that is to just sort of completely shove that away, and I empathize with that a lot, because I think that especially there's part of the book where she talks about how there are people who are paid to do that. There are people who are paid to represent your country, and they're foreign diplomats and they're consular officers, and it's not the job of the artist to represent a nation. And I think it's the worst thing you can do to an artist.
Okay, so I want to shift the conversation a bit to your process of writing the novel and just in writing in general. So what is the process of writing like for you? And what was the process of writing this novel?
Yeah.
What came first, the idea, and how did you progress?
Yeah, so I started off with this idea of, okay, I had this experience, and I want to fictionalize it. And so of course, like while the initial setup of a young girl going from Hindi to Oregon is all autobiography. जहाँ वो वहाँ जाके जो लोगों से मिलती है, like the host family, all of that is completely fictional. And so I started off with this scenario in mind. Uske baad, I finished the first draft in pretty quickly, and then but it was an absolutely atrocious draft, as most first drafts are.
How different was it from this novel that's sitting in front of you?
Extremely different. I think one of the biggest things that changed is that now the novel is written from the perspective of an older Hiraz who might have, noticed when reading the book. So it's told from the perspective of an older Hira looking back at the experience. You don't know how old she is, where she is now, because I didn't want that to distract from the story that is being told. Like, what that allowed me to do was to have a lot of the reflection and the retrospection that thankfully I did, because I feel like that has been one of the most well-received aspects of the novel.
Yeah, I noticed that it adds a very interesting dimension to Hira's own experience,
Yeah.
because she's kind of thinking about it. But you leave that vague on purpose, where
Yes.
Hira is,
Yeah.
whether she stayed in Pakistan or she's living in the US, because it wasn't really relevant, I suppose. To
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think, it's interesting because that was one of the issues on which the editor sort of did push back. She said that perhaps you should locate her, and again, one, I wanted to just leave it. I don't think it's the fact that it's not important, I think it's the fact that I wanted to leave it up to the reader's imagination a little bit, what Hira chooses to do. And secondly, again, I was very nervous about the fact that that would just, because the more you tell the reader about a certain character, the more they obviously want to know, right? So like, if I put in any more details about what that older narrator was doing, I feel like I as a reader would want to know even more. Like, okay, is she married? Does she have kids? So then you can kind of inspire something like that.
Yeah, that's true. So, what are some of the books and who are some of the writers who first made you want to be a writer, and who still sort of inspire, who you look to for inspiration when you read it now?
So I start always with Faiz Ahmed Faiz. This is what I did yesterday too. This is literally what I start every single one of my essays with. It's almost become a joke with like people who've read my work now, that like, oh, where's the like how many lines before the Faiz reference? And so, but it is true. It was one of the first people that I read in Urdu, one of the first poets that I read, and I think that while I don't write poetry myself, I'm very sort of intimidated by it. It is, I hope that I've taken some of that care with language and some of that sort of just like respect for how language works and what it can do when you try to make it useful from him. Then, for better or for worse, of course, like a lot of sort of privileged Pakistanis, I was raised on that staple diet of the Victorians, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and I'm trying to think of, because I think perhaps what is more interesting to me is which books I am in, or this novel is in conversation with. And when I think about that, I don't know if a lot of people here read Seasons of Migration to the North by Tayyib Saleh, which is also very similar in some ways, a story of a young man's journey from Sudan to the UK and back. And so it's that, and then another one that that comes to my mind, and I actually read it after I finished my novel, and I was absolutely astounded by how similar it felt, was Brooklyn by Paul Toybin. I don't know if a lot of people have read him, but that's also, and the funny thing about that is that it's the story of a young Irish woman who moves in the 50s, 60s from rural Ireland to Brooklyn. But what was stunning to me was just how similar her story felt to Hira's, and interesting because now we start pushing back against this idea of universality in literature and how it can be used to just sort of create a hegemony of what is universal. But I do think there are universal things, and that migration obviously is the story of all of us in some ways, and then for some of us it is more perhaps, I don't know, like a discrete, or when we talk about migration across national borders, it means something else, and it's, I don't know. And so I was struck by how similar her story felt, even though it was about an Irish woman in the 50s and 60s, and this Muslim woman from Pakistan in the late early 2000s, yeah.
That's one of the best parts about literature, I think, right? Because you're reading something written hundreds of years ago, and you're connecting so deeply with it. So, Duri, what has been the role of literature and reading in your life, and what role does it continue to play?
Yeah, I met someone yesterday. I don't know if he's in the crowd today, and he's from Multan, which is mentioned in this book as well. And he said something to me that I keep thinking about, and I think it's going to be one of my most cherished memories from being here. And he said that the book felt like a friend. And I mean, so that has been, like as I said, for a lot of children who were prone to just like being that lonely kid in the room reading a book, I think you reach out to a book initially, first of all, as a friend, as someone to keep company. And of course, on top of like after a while, when you start intellectualizing it and you start learning from it, and you form your preferences, and you try to read like better and better literature, whatever that can mean to you. I do think that at its very heart, it's company.
That's so true. And it's interesting you said someone from Multan, because this is the first time that I saw Multan fictionalized in a Pakistani work in English, and I spent a lot of my childhood in Multan because my grandparents were from there. And the imperial leather soap in the bathroom. When I read that, I said, this is amazing. And I loved it. And that's what literature is. You want to see part of yourself, but you also want to see what could be as well.
Yes.
But I love that reading books is like companionship and friendship. So I am an aspiring writer myself. I'm sure there are many here in the audience. What advice would you give to someone who's working on their first novel right now?
Oh boy.
You remember what that was like?
See if you can do anything else. No. So let's start again. I think that there is no question that it is harder to tell some stories than others, especially if you're telling them in English in Pakistan, because as a lot of us know, the landscape for publishing English in Pakistan it's very hard. There are very few publishers. The trade ban with India has further exacerbated things. And so people who write English fiction in Pakistan are constantly complaining about the lack of opportunities. And of course, the book initially got published in the UK and the US, so I can't really speak to that experience. But I did have a somewhat similar experience of having to really struggle to find a publisher for this book, especially in the US. And so, I mean, as cliche as it sounds, just keep going on while knowing that the stakes are obviously in a lot of ways against you. Yeah.
And I mean, this is very specific because I'm struggling with this myself. If you are writing your first draft, right? You're writing it. What motivated you to finish when you reach roadblocks, writer's block? So just in terms of writing the thing, before I've heard even more difficult part of publishing comes. What advice would you give to people who are struggling to finish their first drafts?
Yeah. Again, I've heard this a million times before, but it is true. The first draft, it doesn't have to be good. It just has to be there. And I know of the writer Zadie Smith. She's famous for making edits to her work as she's sitting on the stage to read it out. So the point being that the editing, or like, you can always keep improving a piece of art, and but but do not be intimidated by like the perfection of the final product and what it needs to be. It just needs to, you need to get from point A to point B, and then the editing can come later.
I'll try that. Raza, are you ready for questions?
Please, anyone who has questions, raise your hand. Second row.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My name is Riza, and I just had a quick question. So after your book was released, was there any reaction that from an audience or someone reviewing it that you didn't expect but that really resonated with you? You mentioned the use of language and how people perceive it here, but was anything else as well?
If there's anything that resonated with me. You know what, one of the really brilliant things that has happened is that once you are fortunate enough to publish your own book, there's this entire sort of cottage industry of blurbing other people's books that obviously anyone who is in the publishing world who knows about, where you like give quotes for other people's books. And what has been sort of really wonderful is that the sort of few requests that I have gotten are all from writers writing in other languages that are now being translated into English, which tells me that like there is something about my novel that shares an affinity with that tradition of the translated literature, which I think really needs to be more and more the sort of direction that literature needs to go to. That's been really wonderful. Yes,
Hi, Adurani Pasta. And you are writing for the same paper, so I just want to say, so happy to see your novel, and I've been looking forward to this since a very long time. My question, I still haven't read the book, I just got a copy yesterday, is that what made you think of this name, American Fever? Very intriguing, but what made you think of it?
I just realized you didn't address the name.
The story of the name is that it was the original title of the novel with which it actually went out to the agent, and it was the name until like right before we sent it out to publishers was Consumed, because one of the big sort of parts of the story is that at some point Kira gets a pretty sort of terrible disease, which obviously we all know as tuberculosis, but which was historically known as consumption. And so it was consumed, and then the agent said that, oh no, the novel is actually, it's funnier, and it's consumed makes it's a very weighed down word, and it makes it sound like a different kind of story. And so I was brainstorming, I wanted it to have something about America, because obviously that journey to America is what forms most of the background of the book, and then of course I thought of American Fever, one, because this idea of fascination with the US and its culture, it's sometimes known as American Fever, but it also doubles obviously as one of the symptoms of the disease, which is constant fevers.
I think we have one in the front row.
Yes. We'll take two more questions.
Hello, Arsalan. And could you elaborate a bit about the publishing process? Because, as you said again, the book covers it's a technical standard in English. So, how was that process? Did you face any backlash specifically about finding a publisher in the West?
So you're, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about the American cover, which has Urdu on the cover.
That, as well as the fact, like, for example, the quote when you read about my teacher, having those references that are particularly American or Western, like, was that something that made publishing harder for you, or was it something that came up as well?
Yeah, so it's hard to tell, right, because no one is going to come out directly and say, oh, I don't want to publish this book because it has too much Urdu in it. I think we're past that point, I think, in 2022. So it wasn't as overt as that. As I said, the book did have a very, very hard time finding a publisher in the US, so perhaps that unfamiliarity was part of it. That said, on a more positive note, once I found an editor, and even at that time, because the editor does have a lot of leeway, and she could have told me, hey, let's take a lot of this out. No, there was never any pushback, even on this subject, which a lot of people talk about now, the question of italicizing words. the sort of house rules with the publisher were that they do italicize foreign words, but once I said that no, I don't want to do that, they were very amenable to that. So I think that the good thing is that now more and more, a lot of people are, open to that.
I will assume that we don't have any questions, so
That's fine. Thank you so much, Durre, for this. It was so wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, Mariam.
And good luck on whatever you're working on next.
Thank you.